Using CC licenses and CC license works. This is assignment number 4 prepared by Giovanni Antunes for the Creative Commons Certificate this fall 2020. When it's time to use the Creative Commons licenses to create a collection or to work on a remix or adaptation, it is when we realize that specific guidelines established by the CC group need to be followed. The use of CC licenses in certain situations is a little complicated, and the users, the new authors, must be careful on how they can select and use other authors' works. The CC guidelines state that there are some limits of what we can do with certain licenses, and the rules for some licenses are more limited than others. To describe these situations, we will use the examples of what is known as collections, remixes, or adapted works, and in some cases called also derivative works. Collection works. Collection works, as the word implies, is a series of collective works around a theme that make a new composition, but the pieces in the collection must retain their original licenses. To make a remark for collections, and in the context of the CC world, collections must keep their licenses separately even though they are similar in content or topic area. Remixes. In the context of CC licenses, remixes refer to adaptation of works that change dramatically from the original work, but kept their original license. In other words, a remix can fuse two works. The original work can still be seen on the background, but the new work dominates the scene. What is the main difference between collections and remixes? In a collection, the works don't suffer transformation, but in the remixes, they do. There is another characteristic that differentiates a remix from a collection. Remixes are affected by a country's copyright laws. What is considered an adaptation in the US may not be considered an adaptation in Europe and vice versa. Another names for remixes are adaptations of derivative works. Before we continue, I want to make some remarks on certain points. As mentioned above, in the case of collections, the original licenses are kept for every piece presented in it. This makes the process of putting a collection together less complicated than working on a remix or adaptation. And that is because in the case of a remix or adaptation, the tricky part is to assign the correct license that gives credits to the previous work and assign the proper license to the adapted, modified, or transformed work. Now let's look at an example of collection that I prepared for this assignment. I call it a collection of wildflowers. As you can see, basically, these pictures are very similar. All of them are wildflowers. And then you can see that I also be sure that all of the works presented in this collection kept their original licenses. Then to license the collection, I licensed it as CC by 4.0 because it was my work on the collection. One more about creating collections. As we have learned in the CC certificate course, when we create a collection, we must provide attribution and licensing information about the individual works in the collection. This gives the public the information they need to understand who created what and which license terms applies to a specific content. Now, let's move to the second part of this presentation, which is about the remix. In order to better understand how remixes are done, let's revise some of the Creative Commons Teams rules that have been established to serve as guidelines for an effective remix or adapted work. The CC license team have developed tables that facilitate that process. Also, it is always recommended that the country's copyright laws and regulations are consulted before deciding if the assigned license applied properly. In other words, using a previous work for a collection or remix or adaptation does not eliminate the responsibility to give credit to their authors. Now let's look at the CC tables guidelines on how to assign licenses to a remix of adapted work. The first chart is called the adapted chart. It's used for deciding what to license, how to license an adaptation, and then we can see that in the column on the left is the status of the original work, and on the top is what will be the adapted license. There are two basic rules to license a remix. One is that you can only include works with mutual compatible licenses, and second, the license of the remix must be consistent with the licenses of all of the included works, typically the most restricted license. Let's look at the next table. This is called the compatibility chart. It's very similar to the other. The difference is that in this case, instead of letters, what we are using is the logos and the buttons from the Creative Commons licenses. Again, the X means that you had to go with caution or you cannot do it, and then the marks, the check marks, means that it's possible to do it. The rules basically apply as we mentioned before. You can only include works with actually compatible licenses, and the license of the remix must be consistent with the licenses of all of the included works, typically the most restricted license. I want to give a little bit of background for my remix. I selected an OER project, an Open Educational Resources project, which I put in together in an introduction to epidemiology textbook. This is facilitated by the Minnesota State Educational Department in Higher Education, so it will be available for my students and other students in the Minnesota higher education system and beyond. In the following slide, I will briefly describe how I selected one chapter from another author who had an OER textbook in epidemiology. But before I selected the content, I followed the main recommendations, which is I wanted to be sure that I checked the licensing information and compatibility of the work and planned to remix, which means that I used the tables I already mentioned. It was found that the textbook for which I wanted to remix some content is licensed under the CC by NC, which means that this work can be shared, can be adapted, and is for non-commercial purposes. I also want to mention that the remix is not complete, which means none of the content in the following picture is ready for publishing. It is only present to illustrate the remix in the assignment for the CC Cert Certified Fall 2020. In addition, I have selected only one chapter. That's what I want to remark. And in the following slides, I will demonstrate how I did it, and I will demonstrate the process from downloading the chapter that I wanted to remix, opening and editing in Microsoft Word, and then exporting the files to Pressbooks, which is the books creator program or software that I'm using for my OER project. In this picture, what we can see is how I found the textbook. So I went to the OER Commons website, and as you can see, I search by area. I typed epidemiology and got one that I was interested. Of course, there were other selections. If we look at a close-up to the selected textbook, still in the OER Commons website, you can see that it gives me a description, and as I mentioned, more information is provided also about the licensing. So I was moving in the right direction. After the selected chapter is downloaded from the OER Commons, the file is open in Microsoft Word for easy editing. Another picture here shows the editing process. In this case, I'm adding my own content, which is in red, and the original content from the author that I'm remixing is in black. Then I wanted to add a graph in this chapter, so I created the graph in Excel and imported to Microsoft Word. This shows how the Excel image is added to the text. I showed this other picture before, but I want to show it again because I wanted to say that another image that I wanted to add was preparing PowerPoint. So I prepared one slide PowerPoint with this specific image that I wanted to be sure that it looks nice. So I imported the file from PowerPoint to Microsoft Word. So what we can say here is two things. You could see how I use Excel to develop a graph, an image, and import it to graph. And now I use PowerPoint to import, to create and import to Microsoft Word another image for my book, for my remix. The Word file then is imported to Pressbooks, and now it is part of my OER book. I highlighted the new chapter or remix material, and then I put an arrow so you can see that it's now in Pressbooks and it's part of my draft or my OER textbook, and then it is there now. Here is showing the link for my OER project and textbook in the Pressbook website. Here is how the previous content that you have seen or I showed you in Microsoft Word is now in Pressbooks. I want to say that this remix is now in Pressbooks, and then as I say, I haven't finished it, but I had a link here because I want to show that it gives the Pressbooks software provides you a link that you can provide to people to find your book. I also want to do a little reflection, and my reflection is that working with the CC licenses is hard, especially at the beginning of a project for this assignment. I was intimidated and almost scared that I could not do it. It was so daunting for me, but after reading, searching for information, watching videos, and work from other previous students in the class, and also going back to the readings over and over, I gained the confidence to prepare and finish the assignment. It's kind of funny because I have been teaching for a long time in higher education, and now that I'm doing this assignment, I was kind of intimidated. I guess I didn't want to fail. What are the lessons learned? The lessons learned include that comparing collections to remixes or adaptations, the work in collections is more intuitive and less complicated. It takes time, but it is not difficult. Second is that remix or adaptation is a lot of work, but at the same time, it's probably one of the most richest learning experience I have in the class. It helps the learner to integrate and apply knowledge from the CC certificate, also the readings from the course, and then also it helps to integrate our knowledge that we have in additional software that we commonly use in education, such as Microsoft Word, Excel, and PowerPoint. And then, of course, using the Pressbooks as an editor. Conclusions: when using Creative Commons licenses and CC licenses works, especially for the creation of collections and remixes or adapted work, it is important to keep in mind the following main points. Do your readings about that topic. There is an extensive series of readings, especially from the Creative Commons website, and in our case from the CC Certificate Course Manual. Next, follow the major guidelines established by the CC Working Group to choose your source that you want to remix and then to license the new remix work. Use the CC guidelines, and if you still have questions, please ask people who are more experienced in this work, and this will assure you that you are moving in the right direction. Here are my list of references that I organized by, I put the main ones, then I create another just of images that I use mainly on the collection and also in the initial slides of the PowerPoint, and I also want to give additional credits to Microsoft Office and also to the Pressbook company. Thank you very much.